let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we get plenty of time to go over what we need to go over and plenty of time to give you an opportunity to work on anything that you might need to get done for tonight, or maybe something that you didn't get a chance to complete yesterday. So let me go ahead and pull up the classrooms really quick. All right. So hopefully you had a chance to watch those two videos that I posted yesterday. The How Evolution Works, really good synopsis of the whole process of natural selection. And then the other video, What is the Evidence for Evolution, does a pretty good job of explaining how scientists are able to determine the evolutionary relationships as well as the paths in which organisms have undergone to change into their current state, or what led to their extinction. So yesterday, you also should have finished and turned in your videos about resistance. One of the videos talked about antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance, right? And so there's a couple questions for each of those videos. And then hopefully you started working on your article for classification and taxonomy. It's just like a really short one-page, like web page. And there's some questions that go along with it. Hopefully you chipped away on your EOC study guide. Today I'm going to go over classification and taxonomy a little bit, and then I'll turn you loose to finish up your article or finish up the video that you maybe didn't finish yesterday. So one thing I do want to point out, though, with your quiz is those two videos that I shared yesterday, How Evolution Works and the Evidence for Evolution, those videos are going to make up a portion of your quiz tomorrow. Your quiz will be half evolution, natural selection, and half classification. 5 questions will come from the PowerPoint on evolution as well as your vocabulary. And then the other 5 points will come from those two videos that I shared yesterday. Your classification questions, some of them are going to come from the article that you're reading, right? That'll be due tomorrow, as well as our discussion on classification and dichotomous keys today. I will do a quiz review tomorrow before you guys actually take your quiz. So I do want to talk to you guys a little bit about classification. Let me go to Unit 8. And let me pull up this PowerPoint really quick. So classifying things and classification systems in general are really important. And I don't care what career or what industry that you go into, they're even important for our day-to-day life. So when I was younger, I really liked music. I still like music. But I can remember going into record stores to buy new CDs and new albums, right? And they had the music organized. Now, how do we typically organize music? By genre. Okay, so when you walk into, or back in the day when you walked into a record store, all of the CDs, the cassettes, and the records were all organized by genre. They usually have big signs either on the aisles or hanging from the roof, right? And I grew up liking rock. But your parents might also like rock. And some of your grandparents might also like rock. And the rock that I like, and the rock that your parents like, and the rock and roll that your grandparents like might not all be the same thing, right? So I walk over to the section of the music store that says rock and roll. Are all the albums just going to be all over the place on that aisle? No, right? So we've got genres, and then we're also going to have what? Like subgenres. Can anyone think of any subgenres for rock or rock and roll? Yeah, soft rock, right? So, in the 80s, there was a lot of soft rock, right? And so there's definitely some associations you might think about. If I said, all right, guys, we're going to listen to soft rock, some of you guys might roll your eyes, and some of you guys might stretch out and be like, all right, nice. I'm going to be relaxed, but I'm going to be stimulated. I think about soft rock, I think about like office music. If I walked into an office and people were working and they wanted to have some nice like background music, I would think soft rock. It's entertaining, but it's not distracting. It's up tempo, but it's not necessarily going to make you want to get up and dance, right? And there might be like, hold on, let me mark this person present before I forget. Americana, like old style rock. You might have like rock and roll from the 50s. You might have punk rock. You might have hard rock. You might have death metal, right? And so there's going to be all these other classifications, right? And so we use these to not only classify music, but also to classify living things. Because if we're going to study something, we need to have a way in which to find similarities and to make comparative analyses, right? To compare one organism to the next, right? To better understand. And we even classify foods. And the foods that you eat are generally classified by the group of organisms they belong to, right? So if you go to the produce section of the grocery store, what kinds of organisms or foods might you find? Lots of fruits and vegetables. Now, the really weird thing about the produce section of the grocery store is you're going to find fruits and vegetables, but you're also going to find mushrooms. And if we wanted to follow biological classification systems, the mushrooms really, genetically, and from a DNA basis, should be on the same aisle as meat. They have more in common with us than they do plants. Another really odd thing is the dairy section in the grocery store. The dairy section includes what? All animal products coming from what types of animals? Cows or goats, maybe, right? They're going to make milk and cheese. What can be found in the dairy section of the grocery store? It's generally right there by the milk and cheese and butter, but has no business over there because it has nothing to do with an animal that has an udder. Eggs. What in the world? Right? So different classification systems don't always overlap perfectly, right? So the way we classify foods, right, doesn't necessarily match up with how we classify living systems, right? Because clearly the menstruation of a chicken doesn't belong on the same aisle as milk, cheese, and butter, right? Because that comes from a chicken, which is a bird, not from a cow, which is a mammal, right? And there are some other weird situations where foods pop up and you're like, why is this over here, right? So biological classification systems follow systematic groupings in the same way that we organize music into genres. We put food into, groupings like food groups. We do the same thing with movies, right? We do the same thing with living things. And we usually base it on their characteristics, their traits, maybe the type of cells they have, or even their biochemistry. Now, throughout most of history, there were like three groups. Aristotle and his homies were like, okay, land, water, and air. Like the organism lives in the land, the water, and the air. But why is that a system that leaves much to be desired? What about a bird? Where does a bird go? Yeah, and sometimes in the water, right? What about a frog? Water and land, right? It starts its life in the water and ends its life on land. In fact, when most amphibians are born, they have gills and then they die with lungs. In fact, that's where the name comes from. Amphibious means two lives, right? So they literally have two lives, right? And then this guy, Carolus Linnaeus, came around in the 1700s and he said, guys, this classification system is garbage. Imagine if we classified all music in just three categories. Think about it. How would you even begin to do that? What if you went on your Spotify and you wanted to play Spotify radio and there's only three options for the radio, right? There's no telling what would pop up, right? Hold on, it's people showing up late. Hold on. Right, and so Carolus Linnaeus, his focus was primarily on plants. Why was our attention to improving classification systems turned to plants first? Why not animals? Why in the 1700s would there have been such a motivation to classify plants first? You got to eat them. And not only do you have to eat them, you have to feed them to your animals. And knowing the difference between one plant or another, is that important? Is there importance there? Are some plants poisonous? Yeah, there's some plants out there that if you ate them, you would be dying before you realize that you had made a mistake. And there'd be nothing that there'd be nothing that they could do for you, even now. So in the 1700s especially, you had to know what you were eating because you make a wrong mistake, and that's it. And this became more and more important in the 1700s because people started to travel a little bit more. You know, in the year 800 BC, people probably never left their village. The furthest they had ever been from their house may have been 5 miles, how far they could walk back and forth in a day. So obviously they'd have been pretty familiar with the plants. But then people started to get on ships, right, and travel from one country to the next. And you could be in one country and recognize a flower, end up on the other side of Europe, see that what looks like the same flower, but it's not the same flower. So classifications became really important to avoid dangerous situations. And in the 1700s, if you got sick, most of your medicines would have been derived from what? Plants, right? You'd have gone down to the apothecary. You guys familiar with that word apothecary? Usually the symbol is the little mortar and pestle. It's like the little stone bowl with the little stone grinder. That's where you would have gone and gotten your medicine. You'd be like, my tummy hurts. You'd go there, and they might grind up some peppermint or something for you, right? And so plants were also medicinal. So we had to be able to communicate this and to classify this so that when you traveled, you could identify medicines versus poisons. So he came up with a system based on morphology. When you see this word, that means, what does it look like? Now, is it always best to classify something based on what it looks like? No. So I take 2 CDs, and they're both printed on black, just black ink with white lettering. One of them says, Little Uzi Vert, and the other one says Elvis Presley. I look at them, they're both black and they got white lettering, so they should put them in the same category, right? Now, could you imagine, just for a second, what your grandma or grandpa would think if they went to grab that CD and it said, Elvis Presley, oh, I know this, I like this, Little Uzi Vert. I don't know this, but it looks like the same CD, so I'm gonna put it in the stereo. Could you imagine your poor little Mimi or Meemaw sitting down and wrapping her mind around Little Uzi Vert, right? Or vice versa. Some punk little middle school kids like, yo, I'm hard, man. They see the 2 CDs and they put in Elvis Presley. Their other friends are over. They're like, yo, listen to this album. They put it in, Elvis Presley starts playing, right? Don't judge a book by its cover, right? And so even this left a lot to be desired. He also developed something known as binomial nomenclature. What do you think this means, binomial? What does bi mean? 2. What about nomenclature? What does nomen mean? Anyone know? Name. So he decided that all living things should have a 2-part name. Whoa. What else do we classify with a 2-part naming system? My name is Christopher Collins, right? So this wasn't a new idea. He just took how we named people and said, we need to name plants like this. Now, our names nowadays don't mean anything. But back in the day, your last name told the person what? What family or clan you belong to. In fact, in parts of Europe, you'll see common last names like Jameson, Williamson. What does that last name really mean, Williamson? Son of William. And in Scandinavia, and if you like CrossFit, there's some pretty famous female CrossFit professionals from like Iceland and parts of Northern Europe. The last names are like Larsendottir or Deuter, which means what? Daughter of Loris, right? And so that's how we used to use names, right? And then you'd have your first name. So we kind of decided the same to do with plants. Now, he also came up with like a filing system. So we organized music and movies by genres and subgenres. This is what we use for organizing living things. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, when you look at domain, domain's not even on here. There are only 3 domains on planet Earth. The eukarya, I wonder what that includes. What does eukarya sound like? Eukaryotic. That includes all living things with eukaryotic cells. When I went to high school, which not that long ago, guys, we're talking like 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more. there were only two domains, the eukarya and the monera. And what kinds of cells belong to the monera? The eukarya and the, what's eukaryotic or prokaryotic? So the monera included all the prokaryotes. In the last 15, 20 years, they've actually decided to split the monera into the eubacteria and the archaea, because they realize that even within the prokaryotes, there's a lot of difference. Then we get down to kingdom, phylum, class, and it gets more and more specific. So down here, this moss rose, Rosa gallica, or gallica, or if you were going to pronounce it like Gaica, right? This is in the genus of Rosa, so all the other roses that you're familiar with. But when you get up to the family, Rosacea, this is going to surprise most of you guys. What if I told you that a garden rose and an apple tree are in the same family? They are. Now, when you look at an apple tree and you look at a rose, do you see a lot of similarities? No. If you looked up closely to the seeds, the structure of the flowers, the structure of the leaves, the growth habits, you might start to notice some similarities, right? Now, as we get up further up into the categorizations, like the class, the dicots, the dicotyledons, roses and apples are in the same family as grapes and sweet peas and tomatoes and peanuts. And they belong to the flowering phylum, so everything that produces a flower, right? So even a tomato belongs in the same phylum as a cactus. And then eventually we get to the kingdom of plants. So how are you going to remember this? This is how I remember this. Dumb kids play chase on freeway, go splat. Dumb kids play chase on freeway, go splat. But the real important thing that you guys need to know here is the further we go into these categories, the fewer organisms are present. When I get down to species, how many types of organisms share the same species name? Just one, right? What is our species name? Homo sapien. That tells us the genus, Homo, and what's our species? Sapien. Now, there are lots of Homo sapiens in this room, right? But are there lots of different types of Homo sapiens on planet Earth? No, there's lots of Homo sapiens, but not lots of different types. Are we the only species to ever existed under this genus, Homo? Nope, there was Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, right? And believe it or not, at one point, there were two species of Homo living on planet Earth at the same time. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis coexisted on planet Earth. And there was quite a bit of little conflict and interaction in Europe. In fact, some of you guys might even have DNA that are remnant of the Homo neanderthalis. Some of you guys have Neanderthal DNA coursing through your veins. To go over this binomial nomenclature, right, as Joseph pointed out, here's our scientific name, Homo sapien. The first part is the genus, and the second part is the species. Normally it's underlined or it's written in italics, and the genus is usually capitalized. What organism do you think this is? Canis lupus. We talked a little bit about it earlier this week. It's a wolf. A dog would be Canis lupus familiaris. Do you think lupus, or the wolf, is the only species to belong to this genus Canis? What are some other animals that are very closely related to a wolf but probably can't mate together? Okay, a dog, that's a subspecies of, it's like weird, it's Canis lupus familiaris. But think about nature, because we made dogs. What other kinds of canines, that's where you get that word, canis, canines, exist in nature? Coyotes and a fox, right? So they all belong to that. Now, wouldn't you not agree that they all look very similar? But upon closer inspection, you're like, okay, yeah, there's some substantial differences. This one right here is one of my favorite animals on planet Earth, Pan's troglodytes. And if you want to arm yourself with an insult that somebody might not recognize, this is a good word, troglodyte. Anyone know what pans means? What does pandemic mean? The whole world. So it means like across everywhere. Anyone know what a troglodyte is? Kind of a funny word. If you play like Dungeons and Dragons, sometimes the word pops up, or any kind of fantasy games. It's kind of like a name for caveman. So if you kind of break this word down, because they're usually based in Latin and Greek, it means like caveman of the world. This is actually the scientific name of a chimpanzee. Why in the world did these early scientists and naturalists name a chimpanzee caveman? Where did most of these scientists live? In the 1700s? Where was most science probably taking place? Yeah, Europe. Where can you find chimpanzees? On what continent? Where do we find chimps? Oh, I'm about to have a panic attack. Yes, Africa, right? Now, how many Europeans do you think had ever seen a chimpanzee before in the year 1700? Not many. So could you imagine being a naturalist? And most scientists in the 1700s, were they like out in the field hiking miles, or were they probably in a fancy building studying books and looking at fossils and stones? Probably looking at fossils and stones, right? Because they were rich. They could afford education. So here these scientists are drinking their tea, looking at flowers and drawing. And then some explorer had come back from 2 years in Africa and brings back the skull of a chimpanzee and hands it to this naturalist. Look what I found. There are these animals in the jungle that sometimes walk like men, they look like men, but they're not man. You speak to them, they don't speak back. They don't seem to have a language, but they seem to be intelligent. Could you imagine looking at that skull? You'd probably think, what? Kind of looks like my skull. Imagine if you had a chimp skull and a human skull in your hands right now. What are some differences you might notice about these two skulls? Think about the face of a human and the face of a chimpanzee. What's the first thing that jumps out at you? Think about the skull, though. Yeah, they got a big old mouth, right? Kind of a big, scary mouth with like big teeth. Then you look at the little our mouth with our dainty little teeth. But there's definitely some similarities, right? The lower jaw is completely separate from the skull. You're thinking, okay, it kind of mechanically moves the same way. You see the hole in the skull for the nose, because you know that our nose has no bones, other than that tiny little one right up here. And then you see the little eye sockets, and then you notice like the upper portion, right? That cranial cavity. What would be the first thing that pops out at you comparing the cranial cavity of the chimp and the cranial cavity of a human? Which one would be bigger? Which has more brain space, the human skull or the chimp skull? Yeah, humans, right? And you'd be thinking, okay, this looks like an ancient human, right? So you could see why they're like, it's a caveman. But upon further investigation, what do we know about chimpanzees? Well, they're in the domain Eukarya, same as we are. They're in the kingdom Animalia, kingdom of animals. They are vertebrates, just like us. They're mammals. They're primates. They belong to this family of hominids. And the only difference between us and the chimps is the genus. We're in the genus Homo and then the genus Pan. This is our closest relative. Very, very similar. And you can see how this breaks down. This starts down here at order and makes its way up to species. And here you can see in the genus Homo, Homo sapien, and then maybe Homo neanderthalis, right? And then if you look at the hominids, these are all of like the primates that kind of remind us of people, like gorilla. Like think about, what's that movie? Planet of the Apes, right? It's a bunch of chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, right? Because they're in the same family, right? A lot of similar cognitive function there. And then when we get to the primates, then we get all the old world monkeys and other organisms. So scientists have taken not just morphological data, like looking at the things, they look at inside the biochemistry, the structure of the cells, the enzymes, the DNA, the proteins, and we can produce family trees. Now, what's really neat about this is there's three main groups, right? You got the eubacteria, the archaea, and what do these kingdoms belong to? Animal, plants, fungi, and protists. What kinds of cells do you think they all have? Are they prokaryotic or eukaryotic? Eukaryotic, right? So this blue line right here is the eukaryotes. This red and the purple are prokaryotes. Now, when we started to look at DNA, when we started to look at biochemical analyses, the eubacteria and the archaea used to be in the same category. Why did we change? If these lines are based on DNA, Who are the archaea more related to? The eubacteria or the eukaryotes? Think about how a family tree works. You and your brothers and sisters would be really closely branched, right? And then your aunts and uncles would be a little further away. And then your second, third cousins would be really, really far away. Your great, great, great aunt would be on the other side of the tree. So if this is the common least or last common ancestor, or the last universal common ancestor known as LUCA, you see that the tree splits. It split, and these organisms became modern day bacteria. And this tree split over here, and then split again into the archaea and into the eukaryotes. So again, I ask, who is probably the most closest genetic relative to the archaea? The eubacteria or the eukaryotes? The eukaryotes, right? Because they separated more recently. If this is like ancient history, and the further you go up this tree, the more and more modern we get. People joining this thing. Now, this stuff right here, guys, you don't necessarily need to memorize, right? Because they used to test people on this kind of stuff, and they've kind of dropped it a little bit. If you want to look through it to familiarize yourself with some terms that might pop up, it might be helpful. This is like my favorite part. Unfortunately, we can't teach it. But anyways, with the kingdom of plants, there is something that does pop up a lot that you do need to familiarize yourself with. When we look at plants, this is kind of a neat way to kind of classify things. When you talk about a plant, I said, okay, what kind of plant are we talking about? Is it aquatic or terrestrial? It grows on land. Okay, what might be my next question? Is it non-vascular or vascular? What in the heck does that mean? You guys have veins and arteries and stuff flowing through your arms, and that allows your body to transport stuff. Do some plants have veins as well? Yeah, that allow the roots to send stuff up to the leaves. The leaves can send stuff back to the roots. Well, believe it or not, there are some plants that don't have veins, and they don't get very big. They actually they don't have roots. They have to absorb water from their environments. What kinds of plants live on land? They stay really small, and they have to absorb water either from the air or from direct contact. They usually grow really, really close to water. Algae are not true plants. They're protists. Ferns are a little bigger. They can grow away. They grow on rocks, right on the edge of the water. Sometimes they'll grow on the shady side of a tree. Moss, there you go. Moss, right? So algae, which are actually protists, right? There's a split. Some became the algae, the protists. Then you have the moss. Then from the moss, we get a little further away from water. And now we're what? Ferns, right? Yeah, so these are the mosses. And mosses can't get big because they have no vascularity. But then vascularity evolved. And this would be the ferns, because ferns don't have seeds. They have spores, which is actually kind of neat. So that's why they still need to be close to water. They still need to be in humid environments. Are you going to find ferns in dry climates? No, they need water to reproduce. But then seeds developed. And we got larger trees. And we got the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperms are like cone-bearing trees, like pine trees, right? And the angiosperms are flowering plants. And so this is the evolutionary history of plants. This is a phylogenetic tree. It shows us the genetic relatedness as well as their evolutionary history. Right, so Leah was right. The first type of aquatic plant-like organism was green algae. But it's considered a protist because it lacks a lot of the true characteristics of plants. Then these certain cells develop the characteristics of plants. And the first type of plants were known as bryophytes, or the mosses. They don't have vascularity, so they're really tiny. They have to live right next to water. They reproduce with spores. Then vascularity developed. And that allowed some plants to get a little bigger, like ferns. But again, they were seedless. They had spores, so they still had to be near water. Then seeds developed. With seeds, plants could get a little further away from water. Their roots get a little deeper, the plants get a little bigger, and the first types of seeded plants were called gymnosperms. In fact, that word gymnosperm literally means naked seed, right? Because if you look at the pine cone, the female pine cone, at the edge of every single one of those blades is a tiny little egg. And the male cones are at the very, very top of the tree. I know when I was a kid, my brothers and I used to take the little yellow male cones and throw them at each other all the time, right? We were too poor for like paintball guns. We just throw pine cones at each other, right? We used to pretend like the female pine cones, real big woody ones, were like hand grenades. and the little yellow ones are like your little bullets, right? That's just the difference in the female and the male cones, right? So the female cones open up on the tree. They tend to be near the bottom. The male cones open up at the top, and the sperm just falls based on gravity into the pine cone, fertilizes the egg. So when you find pine cones down laying around the ground, the big ones, you can actually plant it in the dirt and it would grow into a pine tree, right? And then seeds, true seeds and flowers developed into the angiosperms. So most dinosaurs were extinct by about 150 million years ago. Looking at this diagram, would dinosaurs have enjoyed the beauty of flowers? Look at the diagram. When did flowers, or the angiosperms, first emerge? Yeah, about 150 million years ago, right? Because you can see where the flowers started to emerge. And if we go over here, it's about 150 million years, right? So most of the dinosaurs that we're familiar with, they didn't exist on planet Earth with flowers. So there would not have been any flower pollinating dinosaurs or fruit eating dinosaurs, right? Flowers are actually very, very, very recent additions to planet Earth, right? Which is kind of wild to think about, right? It's hard to imagine a world without flowers. But for most of Earth's history, right, it was dominated by these smaller plants, and then for even more portion of it, the algae. Fungi, again, are more like animals, right? So you can see this cellular line kind of developed in the animals, and then the fungi over here, they're mostly decomposers, but again, they're more like us than they are like plants. And then here's the animal kingdom. And you're thinking, oh my God, do I have to memorize all that? No, but you would need to be able to kind of read this. This is called a cladogram. So how this works is, see this word multicellularity? Everything from this point up is multicellular. So all of these are multicellular. From here, true tissues. Everything following this line has true tissues. This does not. So right here, tube within a tube, right? What animals have tubes within a tube? Well, everything from this little roundworm over. So does the platyhelminthes have a tube within a tube? You go down here, nope, right? So they have no body cavities. These are really interesting animals, by the way. According to this cladogram, who is most similar to humans or the chordates? Remember your family tree, closest branch. What is this right here? It's a starfish. You're thinking, what? Yeah, because they have what is known as a deuterostome. Their embryos kind of develop in a similar way to all the segmented vertebrates, right? You don't need to know all this stuff. Unfortunately, it's my favorite part to teach, but this is what we need to know. Classification systems. Let's look at this diagram. What can we learn from this? Most modern day classification systems use DNA evidence. DNA evidence is the best. Protein evidence is probably second best. So we can see this diagram is organized by DNA difference, right? So we're up here, the closer DNA, the further you go away, the less DNA they have in common, and we have age. So if we're looking at human beings, who is, or what group would be humans' closest ancestor? Chimpanzees. And about how long ago did those two species diverge? Remember divergent evolution? When did they separate? So you kind of look here. Yeah, less than 10 million years. That's a good approximation. Who is the human's most distant relative? Yeah, the Galago. How long ago did those two groups diverge? Yeah, about 40 million years ago, okay? And so would you say that the humans and Galago have a lot of DNA in common? No. Do you think they have some DNA in common? Yes. Now, based on this diagram, which two groups are the most alike when looking at DNA evidence? The shorter the branch, the less time has passed since they diverged. So of all these pairings, of all these organisms, which two groups have the most in common genetically? The human and the, right? So there's been very little time Only 9 million years have separated these two species, right? You might look over here and say, okay, well, they're on the same kind of branch, right? But how long ago did the rhesus and green monkey diverge? Well, 15 million years ago, right? So the separation of these two animals is about twice as long as the chimpanzees and the human beings. And then we can also classify things in the field using a dichotomous key. I use these all the time when I go hiking. This is one for vascular plants of the Blue Ridge Parkway. So I can go in the woods and it's a series of yes or no questions. It'll be like, does the flower have 5 petals or 3 petals? If it has 3 petals, go to page 5. If it has 5 petals, go to page 7. Have you guys ever read those books? I know when I was a kid, remember the Goosebumps books? So Goosebumps had these books where you'd like read and it'd be like you hear a creepy sound. Do you go up the stairs or down the stairs? If you go up the stairs, go to page 10. If you go down the stairs, go to page 11. You guys ever read those kind of books? Right? That's kind of how dichotomous keys work. This is also how your doctors and mechanics do their jobs. You walk into the doctor's office, what do they ask you? A bunch of questions. Do you have a temperature? Does your stomach hurt? Have you been able to sleep? Have you been able to eat? Do you have diarrhea? They're asking you a bunch of yes or no questions, right? Because the more questions you answer, the closer they get to what? Classifying your sickness. What about your mechanic? Your car won't start, you bring it in. Or your car won't start and you call your mechanic. What is probably the first thing they're going to ask you? Yeah, they're going to be like, is there gas in the car? You say yes. Is the battery charged? Yes. Then they're going to say like, check the spark plug, check the air filter. And they're asking you these yes or no questions because they're trying to classify the problem. So if I blindfolded you and presented you with an animal and I said, okay, you can reach out and touch it. You reach out and touch the animal and I ask you, does it have dry skin or is it gooey and wet? You reach out and touch it, you're like, oh my God, it's gooey and slimy. What are you touching based on this dichotomous key? I said, is it dry? You touch it and you say no. What is it? Salamander. What if you reach out and you touch it? And you're like, yeah, it's kind of dry. It doesn't feel gooey. And you're like, I feel hair. It feels like hair. Is it a lizard? No, right? Because I said, is there hair? You say, no, so it's not a lizard. And you said, yeah, there's definitely hair. And I said, here, feel its foot. And you're feeling the foot. And you're like, oh man, this is weird. It kind of feels like a human hand. I feel 4 fingers and a thumb. Is it a tiger? Right? No, because you felt a thumb. And so what do you have to decide to figure out whether it's a gorilla or is it a human? Do you guys know what this means, bipedal? What does bi mean? Pedal, feet. So they walk on 2 feet. And I said, yeah, this walks mostly as a quadruped. So it's not bipedal. You'd say, oh, it's a gorilla. Okay. This is a dichotomous key. You'll see this on the EOC. They're pretty easy. Let's try this one right here. I want you guys all to do this because you guys are all going to probably make the same mistake. Look at bird W. Look at this bird's beak. I want you to classify this bird using this dichotomous key. So you always start with question 1. Is the beak relatively long and slender, or is the beak relatively stout and heavy? I want you guys to try this right now on your own. These will be the easiest questions on the EOC if you learn how to use these tools. Just come up with your thought in your mind, and then I'll walk you through it. Okay, what do we think? Is it long and slender or pretty stout and heavy? My last class, initially, they wanted to say long and slender. But I stopped them here and I said, look at the other birds' beaks. If you look at this beak and you compare it to the others, would you still say that's the most long and slender beak? It's kind of long, but I would say the thing that jumps out at me is what? That looks like a really strong beak, doesn't it? Looks really strong, stout, and heavy. So we go to question 2. Is the bottom surface of the lower beak flat and straight, or is the lower beak curved? What do you guys think? Look at the lower beak. So what is it? Geospiza, okay? I want you to look at bird X. Long and slender or stout and heavy? Definitely stout and heavy, right? Bottom surface flat or curved? Curved. So now we got to go to 3. The lower edge of the upper beak has a distinct bend. The lower edge of the upper beak is mostly flat. So if we look at the upper beak, the lower edge, what do you guys think? Mostly flat. So what is it? Platypus pizza. How do we feel about those? Not too hard, right? I'm going to give you a little hint. If you look at it and you think that the first question gives you the correct answer, what should you probably still do? Keep going. Consider the options. If you consider the options, you're like, nah. Like if you go to bird Y, you're like long and slender, stout and heavy. You look at that, that's long and slender, right? But you feel more confident because you did what? You classified the other ones, right? And that's how it works in science, guys. The more you work with it, the more comfortable you get classifying it. As a first-year doctor, are you going to classify or diagnose every sickness right away? That's why doctors work as like medical learning communities. Who is probably going to be the best at classifying sicknesses in the hospital? The youngest doctor or probably the oldest doctor? The oldest doctor. In fact, as a lot of doctors get older, they actually kind of like stop practicing medicine. You know, they're not the doctor that you see in the hospital, but they act as like consultants for pathology. Any of you guys ever watch the show House? The medical doctor show? Well, anyways, people come in, they're sick with all kinds of crazy stuff, and these medical doctors try to figure it out. As a medical doctor, if you can't figure out what's wrong with your patient, you're going to call these consultants, these doctors that have been around forever, right? And you know it's a respiratory infection of some kind. You're going to call a respiratory specialist. They spent their entire careers classifying diseases. You're like, hey, these are the symptoms, right? And you kind of work together. So a lot of times with these classifications, you might find a bird and you look at this, or you might find a plant, and you've been doing this for years, and you're like, I can't find it in this book. Well, then you contact an expert. In fact, the people that usually write these books, they even include their contact information. They're like, hey, if you can't figure it out, take some pictures and send it to me, right? Because sometimes what we think we see and what they intended on you seeing is different, you know? So we'll go ahead and stop there. I will do a quiz review tomorrow. If you have not finished the 8.2 video on resistance, please do that. Otherwise, make sure to finish up your article on classification and taxonomy. Anyone have any questions? Sweet.